For 20 years, they saw her as the woman who just cleaned their guns. They never once asked what she did before that. They were about to find out, the hard way. The heat was a physical presence at the High Desert Marksmanship Center. It shimmered in visible waves off the baked asphalt, making the distant Nevada mountains wobble like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cordite, hot metal, and the dry, dusty scent of sagebrush. It was an environment of aggressive, oppressive energy, a place where egos were as loud as the report of the rifles. And in the middle of it all, there was Aria Thorne. At 40, her movements were a study in quiet efficiency. While the younger soldiers swaggered and shouted, their motions jerky with restless energy, Aria's were deliberate, economical. Every wipe of her cleaning cloth, every turn of a boar snake, every minute adjustment to a scope's turret was performed with a ritualistic calm that seemed utterly alien to this place. Her face, framed by strands of brown hair escaping a tight bun, was a mask of placid concentration. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, missed nothing. She was, to the elite marksman of the unit, a ghost. A piece of the background infrastructure, as unremarkable as the weapon racks she so meticulously maintained. She was the gun cleaner. The technician. Support staff. "Hey, Thorne," a voice barked, cutting through the rhythmic sound of her work. Sergeant Rex Keller, all of 28 years old with a chest full of marksmanship ribbons and an ego to match, sauntered over. He dropped a heavy Barrett .50 cal on her workbench with a thud that made her flinch internally, though her expression remained unchanged. "Make sure you get all the carbon out of this one. Wouldn't want it to jam on a real soldier, would we?" His buddies snickered. Aria simply nodded, her eyes already scanning the rifle's action. "It'll be ready for you, Sergeant," she said, her voice low and even. She could feel their eyes on her as she began to break the weapon down. They saw a middle-aged woman, someone who had likely never seen the inside of a real conflict, a glorified janitor for their instruments of war. They saw her quiet demeanor as weakness, her meticulousness as the obsessive habit of someone with nothing better to do. Aria's inner world was a different story. As her hands worked with an ingrained, unconscious expertise, her mind was a silent ledger of their mistakes. She'd watched Keller all morning, saw the almost imperceptible flinch he developed after 5 shots, a slight tightening in his shoulder that threw his follow-ups a half-inch high and to the left. She saw another hotshot misread the crosswind, holding for 10 miles per hour when the dust devils clearly showed it was closer to 15. They were good. But they were loud in their skill, and deaf to the subtle language of the environment. It was a language her father had taught her, not in the scorching desert, but in the biting winds of Wyoming's high country. "Patience, Ari," he used to say, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "The mountain tells you everything you need to know. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." So she remained quiet. She did her job. She scrubbed away the residue of their near misses and their bragging, enduring their casual condescension with a discipline forged in a place far harsher than this sun-bleached range. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was a shield, and a promise to herself that she had nothing left to prove. They were catastrophically, dangerously wrong about her. And she was content to let them be. For now. Not everyone saw Aria Thorne as part of the furniture. Private First Class Cale Simmons, a new arrival barely out of his teens, was a quiet observer by nature. While the others, led by Keller, engaged in loud posturing, Cale often found his eyes drifting to the technician's corner. He wasn't a great shot, his hands sweated too much, his breath hitched with nerves, and he was fascinated by Aria's unnerving stillness. He saw how she handled the rifles with a familiarity that went beyond maintenance. It was a kind of reverence. He saw the efficiency in her movements, a total lack of wasted energy that he, in his nervous fumbling, could only dream of. One sweltering afternoon, after a particularly frustrating session where his shots patterned like a shotgun blast, Cale found himself in the deserted records office, ostensibly looking for a training manual. On a whim, driven by a curiosity he couldn't explain, he logged into a personnel terminal. He typed her name, Thorn, Aria. The basic profile loaded. Age, 40. Rank, Civilian Technician, GS-7. Assignment, High Desert Marksmanship Center. Former postings, redacted. Service history, he clicked on it. The screen flashed red. Access denied. File classification, Nightingale. Command override, Vance, Alistair, Gen. Kale leaned back, his heart thumping. Nightingale. It sounded more like a code name for a spy than a file for a gun cleaner. And the override. General Vance. He wasn't just any general. Alistair Vance was a living legend, the architect of the impossible rescue during the siege of Al-Khafji Pass, an operation whispered about with a mixture of awe and horror. What connection could a man like that possibly have with their quiet technician? The mystery of Aria Thorn deepened, transforming from a simple curiosity into a perplexing enigma. 2 days later, the enigma walked onto the range. A plume of dust on the horizon was the first sign. It grew steadily, resolving into a convoy of 2 black, up-armored vehicles that pulled to a stop with a quiet crunch of gravel. A hush fell over the normally boisterous firing line. The door of the lead vehicle opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and lean, even in his late 60s, with a shock of silver hair and a gaze as sharp and clear as broken glass. The constellation of stars on his collar glittered in the merciless sun. It was General Alistair Vance. The soldiers scrambled to look busy, their previous arrogance melting into a nervous desire to impress. "Holy crap, it's him," someone whispered. Keller puffed out his chest, running a hand over his short-cropped hair. Vance's eyes, however, swept past the line of elite marksmen as if they were trees. He scanned the entire range, his gaze dismissive of the high-tech equipment and the nervous soldiers. For a fraction of a second, his eyes found the small, unassuming figure of Aria Thorn, standing by her workbench at the edge of the platform. The briefest, almost imperceptible flicker of recognition crossed his face before it was gone, replaced by a mask of stern indifference. No one noticed. No one except PFC Cale Simmons, who felt a sudden chill despite the searing heat. The general had looked at Aria. And Aria, for her part, showed no surprise, no excitement. She simply gave her workbench one last wipe with a cloth and stood straight, her hands clasped behind her back, a silent sentinel waiting for a storm she knew was coming. General Vance observed the proceedings with an unnerving stillness. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable as soldier after soldier took their position to attempt the 1,000-yard shot. It was the benchmark of an elite marksman, a true test of skill, discipline, and an intimate understanding of ballistics. One by one, they failed. The first soldier, a young hotshot with a swagger like Keller's, jerked his trigger at the last second, sending the round wide by a full 2 feet. Vance's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The second, more experienced, accounted for the wind but failed to factor in the spin drift of the bullet over such a long distance. His shot was off by a hand's breadth. The third, even Keller himself, was defeated by the desert's most devious trick. He fired, confident, only to have the bullet strike low. The shimmering heat mirage, the boiling air rising from the desert floor, had distorted the image of the target, making it appear higher than it was. After the 5th failure, Vance had seen enough. The air crackled with his disappointment. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. His words, when they came, were quiet, cold, and heavier than any shout. "Is this the best this center has to offer?" he asked the range officer, though his question was clearly for everyone. A group of men with $250,000 of equipment who can't land a single round on a stationary target at a known distance. A mortified silence descended. The soldiers stared at their feet. Keller's face was flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Vance's gaze swept across them one last time, his disdain palpable. Then, his eyes moved deliberately past the line of uniformed soldiers, past the expensive rifles, and settled on the lone figure at the edge of the platform. "The technician," he said, his voice cutting through the silence with surgical precision. "The woman cleaning the rifles. Give her a shot." If his previous words had frozen the range, these shattered the ice into 1,000 pieces. A wave of disbelief rippled through the soldiers. A few muffled snickers were quickly stifled. They looked from the legendary general to the quiet, middle-aged gun cleaner as if he'd just ordered a cook to fly a fighter jet. Sergeant Keller, his pride wounded, found his voice. He took a half-step forward. "General, with all due respect," he began, his tone tight, "she's not certified for this range. She's support staff. She doesn't have the qualifications." Vance didn't even turn his head. He kept his eyes locked on Arya. "I am aware of her duties, Sergeant," he said, the ice in his voice dropping another 20 degrees. The implicit message was clear: you are not. "And I am aware of her qualifications. Now get her a rifle." The command was absolute. The discussion was over. Keller's mouth snapped shut. His face, a mask of fury and confusion, turned toward Arya. Every eye on the range followed his, their mockery now mixed with a dawning, fearful curiosity. In that moment, Arya Thorne was no longer invisible. She was the center of the universe. And with the calm, unhurried grace of someone who had faced far worse audiences, she took a slow breath and stepped forward. A young soldier, flustered, scrambled to offer Arya his standard-issue M24 sniper rifle. She looked at it, then at him, and gave a small, almost apologetic shake of her head. "Thank you, but I'll use my own." The quiet statement sent another murmur through the crowd. She walked back to her workstation, unzipped a long, worn canvas bag, and drew out a rifle that silenced them all. It wasn't new or tactical. It was a heavily customized Weatherby Mark V, its walnut stock worn smooth and dark with age and oil, its blued steel barrel gleaming with a deep, rich luster. Tiny, almost invisible hash marks were carved near the trigger guard, a private history. It was a hunter's rifle. A master's rifle. It settled into her shoulder not like a tool, but like a part of her own body. She walked to the firing position and lay down on the gritty mat, her movements fluid and sure. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. She was home. As she settled in, the world around her seemed to fade away. The whispers of the soldiers, the oppressive heat, the intimidating presence of the general, it all dissolved into a silent, focused bubble. There was only the rifle, the target, and the space between. Her left eye closed. Through the high-powered scope, the 1,000-yard target danced and swam in the waves of heat boiling up from the desert floor. To the others, the mirage was an enemy, a liar that distorted reality. To Arya, it was a map. She watched the way the waves flowed, reading the invisible currents of the wind. She wasn't fighting the environment, she was listening to it, just as her father had taught her. The world contracted to the circle of her scope. Her breathing slowed, becoming a gentle, rhythmic tide. A long, slow breath in. A long, slow breath out. At the bottom of the exhale, in that still, weightless moment between breaths where the body is perfectly at peace, her finger tightened on the trigger. There was no loud, concussive boom. Just a dry, supersonic crack that ripped through the air. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the wind. Everyone held their breath, their eyes glued to the large digital monitor linked to the target. Then, the screen flickered, updating the impact. A single, perfect, crimson dot appeared. Dead center of the bullseye. A collective gasp swept the range. The soldiers stared, their minds unable to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the impossible feat they had just witnessed. Then, a new sound broke the silence. The sound of a man slowly, deliberately, standing up. General Alistair Vance rose to his full height. He removed his hat, holding it over his heart in a gesture of profound respect. His voice, filled with an emotion no one on that range had ever heard from him, boomed across the desert floor. "Let me introduce you all properly," he said, his eyes fixed on Arya, who was calmly rising to her feet. "This is Lieutenant Arya Thorne, formerly of the United States Army, Chief Marksman for the classified unit codenamed Project Nightingale." He paused, letting the rank sink in. Keller's face went white. Vance continued, his voice painting a picture they could barely imagine. "During the siege of Al-Khafji Pass, an operation with a less than 4% survival rate for the initial rescue team, Lieutenant Thorne provided overwatch. Alone. While our forces were pinned down by 17 enemy snipers, she eliminated every single one of them at ranges exceeding 800 yards. Her precision, her discipline, under unimaginable pressure, is the sole reason 43 American soldiers made it home to their families that year." He turned to the stunned, shame-faced soldiers. "The woman you dismissed as a gun cleaner saved more lives in one afternoon than most soldiers will see in a dozen careers. You are not worthy to polish her boots." The general's words hung in the hot, still air, as heavy and solid as the steel targets downrange. The revelation was a thunderbolt that had vaporized every smug assumption, every condescending smirk. The soldiers stared at Arya Thorne, no longer seeing a quiet technician, but a figure of impossible legend, a ghost from one of the military's most harrowing chapters. One of the younger soldiers, his voice trembling slightly, finally asked the question on everyone's mind. "But, sir, if she's a hero, why is she here? Cleaning rifles?" Vance's expression softened as he looked at Arya. "Because heroism has a cost. Taking that many lives, even to save your own, leaves a scar on the soul that no medal can heal." Lieutenant Thorne completed her mission, but she requested a transfer to a non-combat role immediately after. She refused the Distinguished Service Cross. She refused all public recognition. Arya finally spoke, her voice as quiet as ever, yet now it carried the weight of a mountain. "I still wanted to serve," she said, her gaze sweeping over the young, shocked faces. "Just, differently. The past doesn't determine your present worth. I wanted to be valued for the work I do now, not for who I used to be." The silence that followed was one of deep, dawning comprehension. It was broken by a clumsy, stumbling sound. Sergeant Rex Keller was walking toward her, his face pale, his usual arrogance completely stripped away. He stopped a few feet in front of her, struggling to form words, his eyes unable to meet hers. "Ma'am," he stammered, the honorific feeling foreign and inadequate in his mouth. "Thorne. Lieutenant. We had no idea. What I said, he trailed off, his shame a palpable thing. "I am so sorry." Arya looked at him, and for the first time, a hint of a smile touched her lips. It was a small, sad, knowing smile. "You judged what you saw, Sergeant. It's a common mistake." She paused. Lesson 1 for a sniper: assumptions can get you killed. The formal tension broke. The soldiers, no longer seeing a legend but a teacher, a master of their craft, slowly began to approach. The questions were different now. They weren't about the battle, not about the killing. They were about the how. "Ma'am, how did you read the mirage like that?" asked PFC Cale Simmons, his notebook suddenly in his hand. "Your breath control, it was like you weren't even breathing," said another. "The way you settled the rifle, can you show me that?" They had spent months trying to impress each other with their power. Now, they stood humbled before a woman who had just taught them the meaning of true, quiet strength. Arya, in turn, accepted their change of heart with a simple, disarming grace. She nodded to Cale. "The mirage isn't your enemy," she began, her voice taking on the patient tone of an instructor. "It's a river. You just have to learn to see the currents." A new kind of lesson had begun on the desert range. Arya Thorne accepted no medals for her demonstration that day. She didn't appear in any base newsletters or receive any special commendations. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But within the walls of the High Desert Marksmanship Center, everything had. Her small, oil-scented technical room became an unofficial schoolhouse. Every evening, after the ranges had closed, a small group of soldiers, led by a humbled Rex Keller and an eager Cale Simmons, would gather. There were no drills, no shouting. There was only Arya, patiently explaining the intricate dance of physics and instinct that defined true marksmanship. More than that, she taught them perspective. Every trigger pull is a choice, she told them one evening, holding up a single, inert cartridge. In combat, you aren't just hitting a target. You are making a decision that will echo through families, communities. You have to understand the weight of this, in your hand and in your heart, before you ever earn the right to fire it. A few weeks after the demonstration, Cale and the others erected a small, hand-painted sign at her firing position. It read, 1,000 yards, one shot, LTA Thorn. The next morning, the sign was gone. In its place was a simple note, tucked under a rock. Accuracy matters less than knowing when to pull the trigger, and when to put the rifle down. Her influence spread in quiet ways. The unit's marksmanship scores improved dramatically, but something else changed too. The swagger and arrogance were replaced by a quiet, focused professionalism. The soldiers learned that true strength wasn't about being the loudest voice, but the steadiest hand. The day her transfer to another support unit came through, there was no formal parade. But a handwritten letter arrived for her. It was from General Vance. Arya, it read, if I ever have to face another war, I only hope you'll stand on my side. No need to shoot. Just be there. Your character is the truest weapon we have. Alistair. Arya Thorne's story isn't just about an impossible shot. It's proof that the quietest people often carry the heaviest burdens and the greatest skills. It's a reminder that heroism isn't always found in the roar of battle, but sometimes in the silent, daily choice to serve without recognition. She taught a generation of young soldiers that the greatest victory is not always the battle you win, but the one you have the wisdom and restraint to avoid. The hunter's daughter had found her true purpose, not as an instrument of war, but as a guardian of the peace that war is meant to protect. Call to action. In your life, have you ever known a quiet hero like Arya? Someone underestimated, whose true strength and value were hidden just beneath the surface. Share your story in the comments below. Let's celebrate the invisible pillars in our communities. As always, please comment with respect for everyone's story and experiences. And if you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, hit the like button, subscribe for more stories like this, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching.